Finally, nope, I'm wrong, my apologies. I got a fourth point, sorry. And some of you, I don't know if, I have this idea that maybe somebody encouraged you to watch a video of mine when I gave a lecture recently up at UBC. But I would encourage you to consider the idea of displacement as well. And even more than that, I would encourage you to consider the idea of dispossession, which is a broader term. And towards that, I'll tell you just a tiny bit of a story, because I know you think often and deeply and well about gentrification and about displacement and about who has access to this neighborhood and in what kinds of ways. But, well, let me tell you a really brief story about going to Portland. So I take planning students every year to Seattle or to Portland. And last year I took a pack of 30 graduate urban planning students down to Portland. And we were wandering around the city, looking at various nonprofits and community planning exercises in neighborhoods. And the best part, my favorite part of the trip, because I've done the trip a number of times, is when we go and visit with the Northeast Business Association. And there are some long-term friends. And those of you who know the Northeast of Portland will know that it is a historically black community in a historically extremely white city. And the black community has been both contained and aggressively pushed through inclusive and exclusive zoning and all kinds of reprehensible planning behaviors over the course of the 20th century. So the black community coalesced around two streets well, a whole bunch of streets, but primarily around Mississippi and Alberta streets in the Northeast of Portland. And through the 1990s and early 2000s, as Portland gentrified as a larger city, the larger city of Portland gentrified, a whole lot of the young gentry of Portland, which many of you are familiar with, the very Portlandian kind of cliches, began to notice the Northeast of Portland and how attractive a neighborhood is. And over the last 10 years, that neighborhood has gone from 75% African American to 25%, as the neighborhood has gotten more expensive, and there have been a number of very deliberate planning decisions by the the Portland Development Commission to disperse the African American population. And in a large, pretty dull, and extraordinarily white city, there is no longer a single majority-minority neighborhood left over. And so I often take students to go and talk to friends of mine in the neighborhood, primarily from the Northeast Business Association, that are holding together the black community and the black business community up there. And this, or I guess it was last spring, I had a group of 30 students from Simon Fraser University sitting in a room listening to a couple of activists talk about their experience of displacement and dispossession of their neighborhood. And my buddy John Washington said, he looked out at the audience, and he's a good, fun guy, and he said, you know what, I knew black people were fucked as soon as I saw the bike lanes. And then my friend Joyce looked up, and she said, yeah, and then the community gardens. And that's when I knew black people were done in this neighborhood. And that's not the easiest, so I watched a whole bunch of my students back stiffen and think, oh, Lord. And that's not the easiest for me either to hear, as being a longtime advocate for bikes and bike lanes and for community gardens and for lots of other things. And it's a complicated question there, and I am still, of course, in many ways, totally in favor of bike lanes and of community gardens. But not when they're decontextualized, because there is a much larger set of conversations and rationales around that. And oftentimes, activities and initiatives from eager young people do not take into account the layered history and the implications of their activism. And when I speak about young people, I'm not being opaque. I'm talking about myself. And as some of you may have heard, that some time ago I started something called the Car Free Festival, and I'm quite proud of it in many ways. It's turned into an annual festival of 250,000 people in 4 neighborhoods around the city, and it's done some things that I'm quite proud of. In other ways, I do not have any illusions that the Car Free Days have. I believe that the Car Free Days have had a very significant and I'd say unadorned contribution to the gentrification of my neighborhood. And that is obviously not what I intended. I intended obviously something entirely different than that. And I look back on many of my choices, and I've worked in this neighborhood, like I say, since 1991. doing many things. From a radically democratic, radically pluralistic, ultra-modernity, post-Marxist, anarchist perspective. And yet, how is it that I, in the end, contribute to the gentrification of the neighborhood? And in fact, more specifically, to the pricing out of my friends and neighbors and family. And I should not be too shy about that. And I think we should need to be critical about that. And I look back on much of my activism and much of my work over the years in this neighborhood, in the larger East Vancouver, and I wonder what else I could have done differently. And I'm not interested in flagellating myself publicly or otherwise, but I think it's important that when we consider the actions that we are taking and the activities that we are so sure of and the changes that we perceive to be so necessary in the neighborhood, that we think carefully about those. We think carefully about those implications, and that those things that we are so sure of, and I can see you coming, Rachel, I'm almost done, that they are ensconced in larger and more radically democratic ideas and frameworks of potentiality. And so that's my last thing. Can I have one more minute? Honestly? You can check me off if you want.
We have one more.
Okay, last thing. My last thing then is that I would encourage you strongly to consider the Commonwealth. And I would consider that in a larger sense. Because and I've told this story recently, I know that some of you have been audiences I've told this. Friends of mine arrived here in 1991 with me.
What was the word you used?
The Commonwealth. And I mean that not in a large C, I mean in a small C sense. Friends of mine recently, in 1991, friends of mine moved here from back east, bought a small house just off of Lakewood and Hastings, about $210,000. Recently, it was assessed at somewhere in the mid-950s. So that house, that little tiny house, has raised in value something like $700,000. They've taken care of it. They fixed the roof. They've, painted the house. They've done the things they're supposed to do. But they did not add $700,000 of value. So where did that money come from? That money is a social achievement. And we need to be able to understand that raise in value and the city itself around it that have caused that increase in value as a collective achievement. But what we have normalized is the idea of differential access to those benefits. And those differential accesses and that privilege access to those benefits, the collective achievement of the city, we have normalized to believe that that should be privatized, that that should be enclosed. And so we are allowing certain classes of people to benefit tremendously from the achievements of us all. And I would say that that is true, that those notions of profiteering, I'd say, have, in fact, distorted our ideas, not just of the commons, but of our citizenship, of our neighborliness, and of our responsibilities to one another. But even more than that, I would say that they have distorted our ideas of obligation to the Commonwealth, to the land around us, and to our neighbors. And so what I would suggest to you then is that you look closely at those logics which allow for profiteering from the land, that is to say, differential access to the benefits provided by the social goods that are a collective achievement of us all. And consider then not how you can protect the capacity of a small privileged few to benefit and profit disproportionately from our social achievement, but how you can protect the commons. And I mean that in the widest sense of the word. And in fact, what I really mean is the Commonwealth and how you can protect access for all of us to that commonly held wealth.